But the 1,000 caravanserais which Kublai built were as nothing compared to the great engineering projects he was initiating in China, like the Great Canal. It employed more than 3 million laborers and took more than 10 years to complete. The Great Canal was built to alleviate the persistent famines in northern China, where there was not enough arable land to support the population. But a canal that linked Hangzhou in the south with the great cities of the north would ensure imported supplies. For that, or any age, it was a remarkable feat of engineering. The canal was more than 150 miles long and had hundreds of locks, some of which are still there today. The canal was also cut deep enough to take ocean-going junks. Consequently, ships that had sailed the islands of Southeast Asia could navigate their way more than 100 miles inland. The canal reached towards a large inland port. It was all part of Kublai's great enterprise. At the end of the canal was a new city, bigger and more magnificent than the legendary Chengdu. This was the new capital of the new united China. Here, ships could deliver their cargo right to the Khan's door. "700 years later, there are still some echoes from Kublai's day. During the 1960s, archaeologists dug down to find large sections of the old streets and foundations. For a brief period, it was possible to get a glimpse of the remains of pavilions, temples, and statues. The scholars worked quickly to catalogue their discoveries before it was all covered up and built over. The only other physical legacy of the old capital were the great walls that once embraced it. Like a great many relics from the past, they were pulled down during the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. The last of the great city gates were bulldozed to make way for a freeway. But with the aid of the archaeologists' records and modern computer animation, it's possible to recreate Kublai's greatest success. This was Dadu, the great middle capital, Kublai's ultimate gift to his subjects. It was the perfect Chinese city, built upon Confucian ideals. It was built within a perfect rectangle. The boundary walls ran for 24 miles. Each faced either exactly north, south, east, or west. Inside were two smaller compounds which contained the inner city and the imperial city. The inland harbour swept right up to the trading district. There, rows of warehouses were constructed along a grid of boulevards which designated separate districts for artisans, merchants, and foreigners. Parks and gardens dotted the landscape. But the heart of Dadu was the great imperial city. High officials and envoys entered the inner sanctum from the south, the traditional Chinese approach, through one of 12 city gates. From there, they traveled nearly 2 kilometers down the imperial way towards Kublai's palace. This road passed through the middle compound, which housed government departments, and the homes of civil servants. Just beyond the Huzai Gate, they crossed a series of bridges and continued to the gate of the palace city. In the gate itself were housed more senior ministries, government records, and imperial galleries. Passing through here, the visitors entered the private world of the great Khan. The inner palace city consisted of 3 main halls or pavilions where Kublai gave audiences, conducted court ceremonies, and more private affairs. But for Kublai and his immediate family, these pavilions were never really home. A large area was reserved to the east and planted with grass from the Mongolian steppes, and here they pitched their traditional gurs. This was Kublai's real home, and where visiting Mongol princes preferred to stay, under felt roofs. Here traditional shaman ceremonies took place under the disapproving gaze of the Confucians. In the midst of his ideal city, this was Kublai's affirmation of his nomadic heritage. But the real image of Dadu was an awe-inspiring walled city, which projected immense wealth and imperial power. The source of all imperial power was the area of the 3 main pavilions, the Yud Hall, Gongchen Hall, and the greatest of them all, Daming Dian. This was built on a raised structure that placed it at the top of a girdle of carved marble stairs and balustrades decorated with dragons and phoenixes. The inside was even more elaborate. According to records, there were golden dragons, red mullion windows, gold leaf everywhere. At the rear, at the end of a long corridor, was a private throne room where the most important guests were received. From these balconies, Kublai would greet his subjects during annual festivals and watch as they kowtowed before the most powerful man on earth. But building Dadu was only the beginning. It had to be populated, and not just by merchants and traders. For Dadu to succeed, it had to attract families from the traditional ruling class. Kublai's solution was to turn Dadu into a city of culture, and he would be the greatest patron. Throughout the capital, he built public theaters, and he sponsored companies to perform in them. Kublai himself greatly enjoyed the theater, and his regular presence elevated its importance within society. Hundreds of companies toured the country with a growing repertoire of new works. Drama became more colloquial. It dealt with stories about ordinary people. This was an era of tremendous literary development. One of Kublai's other great passions was painting. He commissioned hundreds of new works. This is Kublai himself at the hunt. His reputation would have shone without a blemish, but he could not ignore his Mongol heritage. He yearned for yet further conquests. This would have been the view from the shores of Hakata Bay in Japan on a summer morning in 1281. Before the Japanese defenders, there appeared a massive armada containing nearly 150,000 men. They had been sent by Kublai to conquer Japan. This was the second such expedition. 6 years before, another invasion fleet had been scattered by a great storm. But this time, with more men and ships, success should have been assured. But the Japanese defenses were much stronger than expected, and the invading army, most of whom were Chinese, had little enthusiasm for the campaign. The invaders struggled bitterly for months to breach the defenses. Then, just when it seemed Kublai's forces would prevail, another great storm blew up. For the second time, the gods of nature thwarted Kublai's hopes. The Mongol fleet prepared to evacuate, but as the soldiers tried to clamber on board, they were cut to pieces. Those that did manage to escape were drowned, for almost the entire fleet was sunk. It was the most humiliating defeat in Mongol history. Nearly 80,000 men went to the bottom. The occasional remnants of Kublai's ambition are still washed up on the beaches. To the Japanese, Kublai's disaster was of enormous significance. The typhoon was no accident. It was a divine wind, kamikaze, sent by the gods to save Japan. This garden is filled with shrines dedicated to the defenders of Hakata Bay. It still symbolizes Japan's conviction that the gods would never allow her enemies to conquer and occupy her territory, and that the Japanese themselves are different to all other peoples, special, protected by the gods. The disaster at Hakata Bay was only one of a number of humiliating defeats that brought little comfort to Kublai during his last years. The end of his life was spent in an alcoholic haze, shrouded in disappointment and shame. When he died in 1294, the empire had seen the last of the truly great descendants of Genghis Khan. In the foothills of the Chinese northern highlands, where the Mongol army first broke through into China, there is a small stone archway. It was set up by Kublai's successors as a lasting tribute to Mongol control of China. On its walls, alongside Buddhist figures, are accounts in 3 languages of the Mongol conquest and the lives of Yuan emperors. But the real and lasting legacy of the Mongol domination of China is here, the Forbidden City in modern Beijing. It was built by successive dynasties on the ruins of Kublai's great capital. Its importance to China owes much to the builders of Dadu, not least because it has remained the capital of a united China ever since Kublai decreed it so 700 years ago. Within the space of just 3 generations, the Mongols had gone from barbaric destroyers to builders of cities. And the Mongols left another legacy, though this is one that they didn't build, the Great Wall. Built by the successors to the Yuan, the Ming dynasty, it was a formidable declaration by the Chinese that they would never again allow their country to be occupied and ruled by foreigners. The Great Wall marked the end of China's trade and intellectual links with the outside world. It marked a return to a traditional, inward-looking way of life. But during that brief period when the Mongols ruled Asia and people and knowledge could move between East and West, the world changed beyond recognition. For example, the Chinese had for centuries printed their most valuable texts from wooden blocks. Thus, papers and books could be printed in unlimited copies. Movable type followed soon afterwards. By the 15th century, printers in the West were doing the same. Gunpowder also had its genesis in the East. The Mongols first encountered it during their sieges of Chinese cities. 10 years later, Hungarian chroniclers recorded its use by the invading Mongol army of 1241. There were also more prosaic ideas from the East. Noodles. Venetian merchants imported the delicacy to Italy, spaghetti. There was another import from the Mongol Empire that had its effect on Europe. In 1346, the Black Death was first recorded among Mongols laying siege to the town of Kaffa on the Black Sea. Within 30 years, this unknown Asian disease had spread as far as France and Britain. It killed 1 in 3 of all the peoples of Europe. By then, the Mongol Empire itself had already begun to disintegrate. First to go was the Ilkhanate in Persia, followed 30 years later by China. The last Khanate to hold out was the Golden Horde, which survived in fragments for almost 300 years. Today, the Mongol homeland has shrunk to a remote enclave. It is back where it all began. The hard realities of the modern political world have left it isolated between the two empires of Russia and China. Today, Mongols are struggling to find a role for themselves in the modern world, a world dominated by the city. Over recent years, tens of thousands of them have abandoned the land and sought the alleged attractions of urban life. Above them are the tower blocks that came with the promises of Soviet communism. Under the dictatorship of communism, Mongolia was crudely industrialized, and the ramshackle legacy of that recent era is seen almost everywhere around its capital and only city, Ulaanbaatar. Now that the Russians have gone, the Mongols have discovered that their country is virtually bankrupt, and the Russian-built factories and power stations are collapsing around them. There are no engineers to operate them, no resources to pay for spare parts. In the winter, the cities freeze, and the power stations belch wasted heat into the sky. For the last 80 or 90 years, the Mongols have been the tools of other people's empires. They have been swept along towards other people's goals. Now, at the end of the century, as they close yet another chapter, communism, in their long history, they are asking themselves, what next? Where from here? For the people who have stayed on the land, little has changed, and little will change. Their lives are bound up in the cycles of the seasons and the needs of their herds. Most Mongolians no longer live this close to the old nomadic life. For the majority, new rituals and new customs have had to be invented. To the traditional Nadam festival, a tournament of archery, wrestling and horse racing, ancient nomadic skills, present-day Mongols have grafted the celebration of their once glorious history. The whole festival has become a distraction from the depressing realities of the here and now. Ancient heroes are brought to life, battles are refought, cities reconquered, and the sayings of long-dead Khans turned into song. These evocations of the past have permeated almost all aspects of life today, from politics to pop music. Even members of the Mongolian regular army are paraded before the crowds in the costume of their ancestors. Mongolia, with a shattered present and an uncertain future, is forever looking over its shoulder at what used to be. The nation's ancient history is the one thing that remains certain. Nevertheless, behind all the pageantry and costumed heroics, Mongolians carry in their hearts a deep devotion to the spirit of one man. A nomad who united the steppe tribes, forged a single nation, and set it on the path to world conquest. Ordinary Mongolians still offer up prayers to the spirit of Genghis Khan. They remember a time when they ruled over the greatest land empire the world has ever seen.